So this morning we continue with the book of Psalms. Last week Chad looked at Psalm 29 and examined the majesty of God and how big and how able he is to conquer anything that this world throws at us. Today we're going to flip the coin and look at a very different psalm showing a very different side of God. I confess, I seldom feel drawn to the Psalms. I tend more towards prose. I like a story. I'm a goal-oriented person who likes to see progression and resolution rather than the openness of living in the moment that poetry usually brings. Sorry, I got to figure out how to move forward. All right. I often find when I read the Psalms, the psalm writers are so in love with God in a way that I don't generally feel, and I tend to feel guilty for not feeling that way or wonder why I don't feel this way more often. Psalms that speak of infinite beauty and mastery of the universe, the magnitude of God's goodness and the bounty of his blessings. Certainly, I believe all of this is true, so why don't I feel compelled to gush about these things? Probably it's for the same reason that I'm not a songwriter. My pragmatic personality isn't really suited to that role. Is anyone else here like that? Pragmatic, down to earth? Yeah, awesome. I'm glad I'm not the only one. We can't all be poets. We can't all be songwriters. We have to leave something for Chad and Keith and the rest of them to do, right? I am, however, attracted to the tragic, the pain-filled, the crying out to God type of psalms, sad psalms, psalms filled with pain. Most of my life, I have loved stories of tragedy. In my studies of literature, it was Thomas Hardy and Charles Dickens and Timothy Findley and Gabriel Garcia Marquez who captured my attention. Authors who wrote of tragedy. Sometimes the novels ended in redemption, but many times not. There's something about entering into another person's pain that evokes such strong feelings, and being able to wallow or live there in another person's pain brings profound feelings that are so moving. I'm not one who seeks pain in my life, but let's face it, sometimes life is painful, and at some point all of us are going to face pain. Some of us have it ongoing. But this is the beauty of poetry and music. It evokes a feeling. It can remind us of a moment in our lives, whether it's that moment in the memory of the first date, or the parent that we lost, or the trip that we took to Venice, or the song that got us through a painful breakup. We can all get lost in a moment through the power of poetry and song. So when I began to look at the Psalms to study and figure out which one I would like to preach on today, I looked for the darkest, saddest psalm I could find. And lo and behold, I found it in Psalm 88. If ever there was a story of doom and gloom, this psalm has it. It begins in pain and suffering, and it ends in pain and suffering. Aren't you excited for the rest of the sermon? Okay, let's read Psalm 88 together. I think we should have it on the screen. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out to you by day. I come to you at night. Now hear my prayer. Listen to my cry, for my life is full of troubles, and death draws near. I am as good as dead, like a strong man with no strength left. They have left me among the dead, and I lie like a corpse in a grave. I am forgotten, cut off from your care. You have thrown me into the lowest pit, into the darkest depths. Your anger weighs me down. With wave after wave, you have engulfed me. You have driven away my friends by making me repulsive to them. I am in a trap with no way of escape. My eyes are blinded by my tears. Each day I beg for your help, O Lord. I lift my hands to you for mercy. Are your wonderful deeds of any use to the dead? Do the dead rise up and praise you? Can those in the grave declare your unfailing love? Can they proclaim your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Can the darkness speak of your wonderful deeds? Can anyone in the land of forgetfulness talk about your righteousness? O Lord, I cry out to you. I will keep on pleading day by day. O Lord, why do you reject me? Why do you turn your face from me? I have been sick and close to death since my youth. I stand helpless and desperate before your terrors. Your fierce anger has overwhelmed me. Your terrors have paralyzed me. They swirl around me like floodwaters all day long. They have engulfed me completely. You have taken away my companions and loved ones. Darkness is my closest friend. Wow. This psalmist is a person in deep pain and suffering. Can you feel his terrible pain, his anger, his despair, terror, abandonment, loneliness? There's no happy ending here. No rescue or wonderful resolution of God saving him from his pain and death. This is a psalm that comes from the depth of a man's pain. I would like to explore two things this morning. What can we learn about this psalm and its author? So we'll look at a little history. And why would a psalm like this even be included in the canon? When I think about the Psalter, I imagine it kind of like a best of collection. Best of the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir, best of Hillsongs, best of the tribes of Israel. Some songs praise God for his many blessings, and others cry out for mercy or beg for his presence. But despite the many songs I have learned growing up in the church, I can't think of any worship songs screaming at God for abandoning us and blaming him for giving us the life we have, contemplating death and ending in darkness. The Psalms are known to be corporate worship songs representing the body of Israel. However, this psalm does not really sound like something a congregation would sing together. There is some discussion among scholars as to whether the psalm was really written to be sung as a group or if it was the lament of just one person. It sounds so much like the personal suffering of one man to me. Can you imagine getting together Sunday morning and singing this song before a sermon? It would certainly be a very doleful, heavy service. Do you remember back to last Sunday when Chad spoke of the 3 different categories of the Psalms? These categories were developed by Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, Walter Brueggemann, and he lays them out in his book, The Message of the Psalms. So, does anyone remember the 3 categories? Yeah, you don't count. Anybody else? Something better. So life is good, life is despair, and then moving out of the despair into something better. Very nice. So Brueggemann calls them Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of new orientation. And I think it's not too hard to see that this psalm falls into the category of Psalms of disorientation. Let's take a closer look at this psalm. So the lyrics to the tune of a melody named Mahalath, which as far as scholars can tell means sickness. The fact that the lyrics and the title of the song are in line shows that the music director made some effort to match the words of the song to the tune of the song. So last week, Chad mentioned that the Israelites often adopted old Canaanite songs and just changed some of the words, like the deity, and then they used it in their worship pretty much exactly the way it was from the Canaanite tradition. Well, this melody was likely a well-known tune used to convey feelings of sadness and sickness. The style of the poem is called a maskil, or a teaching poem, which begs the question, if this is a teaching poem, what can we hope to learn from it? How demoralizing and painful and hopeless life can be? I hope there is more, and I know that we'll get to that later. As to the author himself, the psalm is attributed to a songwriter named Heman. The preface to Psalm 88 states, "For the choir director, a psalm of the descendants of Korah, a song to be sung to the tune, The Suffering of Affliction, a psalm of Heman the Ezrahite." Heman was one of the 3 music directors appointed by David to have charge over the music in the house of the Lord. So this group was Heman, Asaph, and Ethan, and they're traditionally known as the first music committee in Israel. And to be a part of this committee was a great distinction. Because the psalm is attributed to Heman, doesn't necessarily mean that he wrote the psalm or suffered the afflictions noted in the lyrics. However, it is the only psalm attributed to Heman and is also the most puzzling of all the psalms. Puzzling for its darkness, puzzling for its lack of resolution. Whoever wrote this psalm is certainly an individual stricken with sickness. The psalmist seems to have some kind of a wasting disease with which he has been afflicted from youth, maybe leprosy or palsy. And it has cost him his friends. They can't even look at him anymore, and he is now at the point of death. He says, "I am as good as dead, like a strong man with no strength left. They have left me among the dead, and I lie like a corpse in a grave. I have been sick and close to death since my youth." In the moment when he writes this psalm, he clearly feels that God has afflicted him with sickness and pain, that God controls the state of his life, and that he has done something to make God angry. "You have thrown me into the lowest pit, into the darkest depths. Your anger weighs me down. With wave after wave you have engulfed me. Your fierce anger has overwhelmed me. Your terrors have paralyzed me." His description of himself exposes both his physical and emotional state. Not only do we learn of his lifelong illness, we also learn of the wretchedness of his soul. He's at the breaking point spiritually, the end of his rope. He is sick both physically and spiritually. If we were to diagnose this man by today's psychological terminology, we would probably say he suffers from nervous exhaustion, suicidal tendencies, rejection, a sense of inferiority, claustrophobic paranoia, and melancholia. It's a pretty heavy load. Certainly, it wouldn't be hard to believe that someone in his physical and emotional state would be suicidal. So when he begins to contemplate death in verses 10 through 12, we can certainly understand this. I'm sure death seemed like a reprieve for him from all his pain. He questions whether death might be a better friend than life has been to him. And then he goes to another level. He begins to ponder whether there is consciousness beyond the grave. Is there life after death? I imagine at some point all of us have wondered if there is life after death and what that life looks like. He likely believed that if God was going to work any miracle in his pathetic life, he had a very small window of opportunity left before he passed into death. Walter Brueggemann, in the Message of the Psalms, notes the use of language in verses 10 to 12 is very interesting. It offers 3 rhetorical questions, and each question juxtaposes the psalmist's situation with God's usual actions. So let's listen to the question. I think we might have it on the screen too. Okay, good. So you can see the green and the blue, or the red and the blue, highlighting the juxtapositioning. Are your wonderful deeds of any use to the dead? Do the dead rise up and praise you? Can those in the grave declare your unfailing love? Can they proclaim your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Can the darkness speak of your wonderful deeds? Can anyone in the land of forgetfulness talk about your righteousness? So we've got dead, grave, destruction, darkness, land of forgetfulness, juxtaposed against God's wonderful deeds. Praise, unfailing love, faithfulness, wonderful deeds, and righteousness. As he contemplates the possibility of an afterlife, the pattern of words he uses show the disparity between where he lives and what God does. The fact that he is seriously contemplating the afterlife shows that suicide is a real and present option for him. And what answer does he receive for his rhetorical questions? Nothing. Nothing. God is silent. So in the end, he resumes his cry for help, but God does not respond, and the poem finishes with darkness. Verse 18, you have taken away my companions and loved ones. Darkness is my closest friend. The last theological word here is darkness. Nothing works, nothing is changed, nothing is resolved. This ending is what makes it the most somber and disturbing poem in the Psalter. The afflicted man cries out to God again and again, and God doesn't respond. The reader is left to presume he dies, his cries unanswered, and in agony. At least that's my takeaway. Not a happy ending. Not the kind of God I want to believe in. Not the kind of God I want to tell all my friends and neighbors about. The Interpreter Bible Commentary notes that nowhere else in the Bible is the problem of uncompensated trouble so hopelessly portrayed. So, is that it? Is this just a story of complete hopelessness? What do we do with a story like this? Why is this psalm included in the Psalter? It doesn't seem to be a great corporate worship song, nor does it have much sense of hope or redemption. It only seems to show a God who is unavailable and uncaring in our plight. Brueggemann notes that since the Enlightenment, many theological teachings have encouraged us to seek only victory and strength, to move from victory to victory, censoring our voices of darkness and disorientation. But this denies the reality. This way of faith ignores the book of Psalms and belies the real walk of faith. Psalm 88 shows us what the cross of Christ is all about: faithfulness in scenes of complete abandonment. When we read the Psalms, we see the crying out to God in negativity with complaints of various kinds. Screams of vengeance and profound shame are all foundational to a life of faith in this particular God. We have a God with whom we can come to in all stages of our life, with all manner of honesty, in the midst of profound pain and abundant happiness, in the midst of the tension between knowing God has provided so much and living with that one horrible pain that gnaws at us, never giving us rest. The words of Psalm 88 are real. They're hard, they're harsh, they're almost unbearable. They don't sugarcoat a painful, hopeless situation. They offer only raw response to an awful situation. The psalmist is simply telling us what it feels like to be a partner of God in the midst of his complete and inexplicable silence. This psalm embodies one of the main problems of the Christian faith: trusting a God who seems unavailable. Have you ever cried out to God for help, begging him to hear your pleas, and received no response? Yeah, I'm sure we all have. And when you're at your lowest point, does God seem far and unavailable? When in despair, all we are left with is a command to love God. In Mark 12:29, Jesus tells us the most important commandment. Jesus replied, "The most important commandment is this: Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only God, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength." Really? That's it? That's it, God? Can't you see I'm bleeding here? Can't you see the gaping wound of my soul spilling onto the pavement? You ask too much. It's too hard. So I'm not going to trust you. I will find something else to bring me a sense of fulfillment and to ease my pain. I'm sure the psalmist looked to a variety of distractions to ease his pain. He even looked to suicide as an alternate to trusting God. If only the pain would stop for a moment. If only I could just fall asleep and never wake up again. I wouldn't feel this pain. I'd feel better. There is much about the psalm that tells me that life is uncertain, and God has not promised to bring me the happy life I desire. It speaks to me of death, of dying to all that I could ever cling to. The psalmist had nothing left except what sounds like a painful life alone in a ditch, and he still clung to the hope that God would deliver him, that God would not abandon him. But where was God, and why didn't he answer? Just like Job learned he must die to live, is this the message of Psalm 88? Choose to trust God even when life is not promised, even when God is silent. Trust so brave and unrelenting that when there's no light at the end of the tunnel, we still cry out to God for rescue. Can I be that person? I'm not sure I want to ask the hard questions, walk the dark night in the bitter cold. I think I'd prefer to shape God into someone who I can look to for fulfillment of my desires, someone who always listens and responds, who doesn't allow me to face the suffering I dread, someone who responds when I cry. And how about you? What will you do with the God of Psalm 88? Will you walk away from him? Try to shape him into a God of your own fashioning? Or cling to him as he is, What if he doesn't answer you in your pain and suffering? What if you don't see the light ahead? Will you cling to him with the bravest flicker of hope, knowing deep down inside that despite all you face, he is really and truly your only option? I would like to end by reading a parable written by Larry Crabb. The parable lines up really nicely with this psalm, and I thought I would finish with it because I can't really get through a sermon without a Larry Crabb quote. The man's life was pleasant, so too was his worship. The two always go together, and God was not pleased. So he allowed the man's life to become unpleasant. The man responded at once with shock. How can this be? How can this be happening in my life? Beneath the shock, the man was smug, but he couldn't see it. He thought it was trust. This will soon pass. God is faithful. Life will again be pleasant, and his worship remained shallow. God was not pleased, so he allowed more unpleasant things to happen in the man's life. The man tried hard to handle his frustrations well. Like someone who trusted God, I will be patient, he resolved. But he didn't notice that his effort to be patient grew out of the conviction that a pleasant life was his due. He didn't hear his own heart saying, if I am patient, God will make things pleasant again. That's his job. His worship became a way to convince God to restore his pleasant life. God was not pleased. So he pulled back his hedge of protection around the man a little further. The man's life became miserable. The man got angry. God seemed unmoved, indifferent, uncaring. Heaven's door slammed shut. The man knew he couldn't pry it open. He could think only of better days. Not of better days coming, but of better days before. Days that no longer were and that showed no sign of returning. His highest dreams were a return to those days, to the pleasant life he once knew, when he felt what he had called joy. He could not imagine a higher dream than going backward to what once was. But he knew life never moved backward. Adults never become children again. Old people never recover the energy of their most productive years. So he lost hope. God had withdrawn his blessing, and there was no indication he would change his mind. The man fell into depression. His worship stopped. God was not pleased. So he released the forces of hell into the man's life. Temptations that formerly were manageable now became irresistible. The pain of living was so great that the pleasure the temptations afforded, relief really, came reasonable and seemed reasonable and necessary. But after the pleasure came a new kind of pain, a kind of pain that covered his soul with a fog that not even the brightest sun could penetrate. The man could see only his pain. He couldn't see God. He thought he could, but the God he saw was one whose job it was to relieve pain. He could imagine this God, but he couldn't find him. He addressed the only God he knew. He begged for help. And beneath his words of pleading, he could almost hear what his heart was saying. You owe me help. I will never believe I deserve all this to be happening to me. This pain is not my fault. It is yours. His worship had always taken the form of a demand, but now the demand was so obvious the man could almost recognize it. God was not pleased. So he let the struggles continue, and God allowed new troubles to come into the man's life. In the part of the man's heart that dreamed his greatest dreams, he had been certain he would never have to face these new troubles that were now in his life. For years he had said in his heart, without actually hearing it, this could never happen to me. If it did, my life would be over. If that happened, I'd have no choice but to conclude that God isn't good. I would have to dismiss God, and no one, not even God, could fault me. But still, the man could not hear his heart speak. What he could hear was a seductive voice that made the worst temptation he had ever faced, to lose hope in God, seem noble, brave, defiant, the only way left for the man to find himself. The battle waxed hot, but a flicker of hope remained. The man held on to his faith. Even as he did, he could hear his heart saying, I have every right to give up on my faith. but I am choosing the truly noble way. I still believe in you. I still believe you're there and that my highest hopes for joy, whatever hopes are left, lie with you. Does that impress you? If not, my God, what does? His worship was more desperate than ever, but it was still proud. God was not pleased. So he allowed the man's trials to continue and his pain to remain unabated. God kept his distance from the man. He provided no comfort, no tangible reason to hope. It was difficult for God not to make everything better in the man's life. It was even more difficult for him not to appear directly to the man and assure him of his presence. But he didn't. God had a greater dream for the man than a return to a pleasant life. He wanted the man to find true joy. He longed to restore the man's hope for what mattered most, but still the man did not know what that was. The fog around the man's soul thickened until he could feel it, like walls closing in. All that was left was mystery. There was fear, certainly, even terror, but more acute was the sense of mystery. The mystery of a bad life and a good God. Where was he? When the man became most aware of his need for God, God disappeared. It made no sense. Was God there or not? If he was, did he care or didn't he? The man could not give up on God. He remembered Jacob, so he began to fight. But he fought in the dark, a darkness so deep that he could no longer see his dreams of a pleasant life. In deep darkness, you cannot see, but you can hear. He could hear for the first time what his heart was saying. "Bless me," he cried from his deepest soul. He could hear the words reflecting a resolve that would not let go of God. "Bless me, not because I am good, but because you are good. Bless me, not because I deserve your blessing, but because it's in your nature to bless. You really can't help yourself. I appeal not to who I am. You owe me nothing. I appeal only to who you are." He still saw his pain, but now he saw God. And the cry for blessing was no longer a demand for a pleasant life. It was a cry for whatever God wanted to do, for whoever he was. The man felt something different. It was the beginning of humility. But the very fact of what it was kept him from seeing what it was. The man had forgotten himself and discovered his desire for God. He didn't find God right away, but he had hope. Hope that he might experience what his soul most deeply longed for. And then he saw it. Fresh water bubbling up from a spring in the desert of his soul, and he saw it. It was a new dream. He could see its contours take shape. It was a dream of actually knowing God and representing him in an unpleasant world. The dream took on a specific focus. He saw how he could know God and represent God to others in a way that was his way, not someone else's. And it felt like coming home. He realized immediately that his power to speak on behalf of God to others in the midst of their unpleasant lives depended on his speaking from the midst of his own unpleasantness. He had never before felt grateful for his troubles. His suffering became to him a doorway into God's heart. He shared God's pain in his great project of redemption, suffering together for a single cause that made him feel closer to God. A new thought occurred to him. I will join with whatever forces are opposed to the root of this unpleasantness. I will ally with goodness against evil. I won't wait to see more clearly what my hand finds to do. I will do it. But I will stay close to the spring. My soul is thirsty. My pleasant life is not water for my soul. Whatever comes from God, whoever God is, this is the only true water. And it's enough. The man worshipped God, and God was pleased. So God kept the water bubbling up out of the spring in the man's soul. And when the man didn't drink every morning from the spring or return every evening to drink again, his thirst became intolerable. Some things in his life got better. Some things stayed the same. Some things got worse. But the man was dreaming new dreams, greater dreams than a pleasant life, and he found the courage to pursue them. He was not a man with hope. He was now a man with hope, and his hope brought joy. God was very pleased, and so was the man. I know we all have suffering in our lives, and sometimes it's easy to just cower away when you suffer. But I feel like this parable coaches us to speak out of your place of pain into other people's lives when they too are suffering and have pain. Don't lose hope. I feel terrible for Heman, whoever he was, and the terrible story that he had in his psalm. But it was a moment in time. Poetry is written at a moment in time, and that could have been his most profound low point. So take hope, find joy. Have a great week. Thank you.